"What money are you talking about, Emily?" Robert Carter asked, and then he laughed, a short, casual laugh that didn't match the weight of the number she had just said. The dining room smelled like rosemary chicken and lemon polish, the same way it had every Sunday night for as long as Emily could remember, and for a split second she wondered if she had imagined the tension tightening around her chest, but she hadn't. She had leaned forward in her chair, palms flat against the oak table her father had refinished years ago, and calmly reminded him, "The $144,000 I've been sending you for the past 4 years. The rent you promised to save for my future house." Her mother, Linda, froze with her fork halfway to her mouth, eyes fixed on her plate as if the green beans required careful study. Robert leaned back instead, folding his arms over his chest, still wearing that half-smile like Emily had just told a joke that didn't quite land. For 4 years, Emily had transferred $3,000 every single month, wiring it directly into the joint account her parents told her they had set up just for her. A safe place, they'd said, where her money would grow untouched until she was ready to put a down payment on a home of her own. She had believed them because they were her parents, because they had always talked about discipline and sacrifice, because they had insisted that living under their roof after college wasn't free, but was an investment in her future. She had skipped vacations with friends, driven the same aging Honda Civic with 110,000 miles on it, packed lunches instead of eating out, and told herself that every small denial was stacking bricks toward the house she would one day own. When she finally met with a mortgage lender in Columbus and learned she was pre-approved, she drove straight to her parents' house with a folder full of paperwork and a cautious excitement she hadn't felt in years. She had pictured this dinner differently. She imagined her father nodding proudly, her mother reaching across the table to squeeze her hand, maybe even a small toast with the cheap white wine they kept for special occasions. Instead, she got that laugh. "Emily," Robert said, shaking his head as if she were confused about something obvious, "that was rent. You lived here. Until you were 28. The word rent landed heavier than the number ever had. She stared at him, searching his face for a hint of miscommunication, some sign that he was testing her or teaching her a lesson about contracts and clarity, but there was nothing except calm certainty. Linda finally spoke, softly, without looking up. "Your father handled the finances." The room felt smaller, the walls closer, the familiar family photos along the hallway suddenly distant artifacts from a story that no longer fit. Emily realized then that the money she had counted on, the $144,000 she had tracked carefully in her budgeting app, the future she had constructed in quiet, obedient installments, might not exist the way she thought it did at all, and her father's laugh was not confusion or humor, but something far colder, dismissal. Emily did not argue at the table that night because arguing would have required hope, and hope was already slipping through her fingers. She drove back to her apartment in silence, the highway lights blurring past her windshield as she replayed every conversation from the past 4 years, every reassuring sentence her parents had spoken about discipline, about sacrifice, about building something solid for her future. She remembered the afternoon her father first suggested the arrangement, how he had sat across from her at the kitchen counter with a yellow legal pad and drawn neat columns, explaining that if she paid $3,000 a month to them instead of to a landlord, they would protect it from her own temptation to spend it. He had called it a forced savings plan. He had said it was what responsible families did. At 28, newly promoted at her marketing firm and eager to prove she was mature, she had felt grateful. She had signed nothing because she had trusted everything. Each month after that, she scheduled the transfer before paying any other bill, watching the confirmation screen appear on her banking application with a small flicker of pride. $3,000. Then $6,000. Then $12,000. The number had grown quietly, steadily, like something alive. She kept a spreadsheet on her laptop, color-coded and precise, tracking the total as it climbed toward $144,000. Sometimes, on nights when she felt discouraged about sharing an apartment with a roommate or skipping another weekend trip, she would open that spreadsheet and imagine a modest 3-bedroom house with a small yard and a white mailbox at the curb. She had pictured inviting her parents over for dinner in that house, serving them on a table she had chosen herself, thanking them for helping her get there. Now, sitting at the red light outside her building, she realized that every image she had built depended entirely on a promise that had never been written down. When she reached her apartment, she did not turn on the television or change out of her work clothes. She sat at her kitchen table with her laptop open and began scrolling through her bank history, month by month, year by year, each transfer labeled simply as rent. The word stared back at her, plain and clinical. Rent. Not savings. Not investment. Rent. She added the numbers again, even though she already knew the total. $144,000. The figure felt heavier now, no longer a stepping stone but a weight pressing against her chest. For the first time, she allowed herself to consider a possibility she had avoided all evening. Her father had not laughed because he was confused. He had laughed because, in his mind, the arrangement had always meant something different, and she had been the only one who believed otherwise. Emily barely slept that night, and when her alarm went off at 6:30 the next morning, the room felt unfamiliar, as if something essential had shifted while she was lying there in the dark. She went through her routine automatically, showering, dressing in a navy blouse and gray slacks, pouring coffee into a travel mug she did not remember filling, but her mind remained fixed on one sentence. It was rent. The word echoed with a dull finality. On her drive to the office, she began reconstructing the early years with sharper clarity, replaying details she had once dismissed as harmless. She remembered how her father had insisted on handling all discussions about the money, how her mother would leave the room whenever finances came up, saying she trusted Robert completely. She remembered asking once, lightly, whether they should draft something formal, maybe just a simple agreement for peace of mind. Robert had waved the idea away with a laugh, saying contracts were for strangers, not for family. At the time, she had felt embarrassed for even suggesting it, as if asking for documentation implied doubt. Now, sitting at her desk before anyone else arrived, she opened her email and searched for old messages from her father. There were dozens about transfer confirmations, short replies that said things like got it or good job staying consistent, kiddo. Not once did he write the words savings or house fund. Every reference was neutral, careful, almost technical. Emily leaned back in her chair and stared at the ceiling tiles above her workstation, noticing how clean and orderly they looked compared to the mess forming in her thoughts. She began to see a pattern that had been invisible before. When her parents remodeled their kitchen 2 years ago, installing quartz countertops and stainless steel appliances, her father had joked that retirement was treating them well. When they purchased a new sport utility vehicle last spring, he had said it was a practical investment. She had never connected those expenses to her monthly transfers because she believed her money was separate, untouched, preserved. Now she could not ignore the possibility that it had never been separate at all. Around 9 o'clock, her phone buzzed with a message from her mother that simply read, "Your father did not mean to upset you. You know how he is." The text was soft, almost apologetic, but it avoided the one thing that mattered. It did not say the money was safe. It did not say there had been a misunderstanding. It did not say they would fix it. Emily read the message twice and felt something inside her settle, not anger, not panic, but a slow, deliberate shift from trust to clarity. For 4 years, she had operated on the assumption that her parents were protecting her future. Now she had to consider a different assumption, one that was far less comforting and far more precise. They had protected their own. By the end of the workday, Emily had already made a decision that surprised even her. She would not send another dollar until she understood exactly where the previous $144,000 had gone. The thought felt both frightening and stabilizing, like stepping onto thin ice and realizing it might actually hold. That evening, instead of going home, she drove back to her parents' house, the same split-level property in suburban Ohio where she had grown up and where she had lived until she was 28. The porch light was on, casting a soft yellow glow across the driveway, and for a moment she felt like a teenager again, returning after curfew, rehearsing an explanation. But this time she was not asking for permission. Robert opened the door before she knocked twice, as if he had been expecting her. His expression was calm, almost patient. "Emily," he said, stepping aside to let her in, "you are overthinking this." She did not remove her coat. She did not sit down. She stood in the living room, surrounded by new furniture she did not remember seeing before, a large flat-screen television mounted above the fireplace, fresh paint in a shade that looked professionally applied. "I am not overthinking," she replied evenly. "I am asking for clarity." Linda appeared in the hallway, hands clasped together, her eyes moving between them. The house looked comfortable, upgraded, secure. Emily felt the contrast sharply. She had spent years calculating grocery budgets down to the dollar, declining weekend trips, delaying the purchase of a new mattress even when the old one sagged in the middle. "You told me it was for my future home," she said. "You said you would keep it safe." Robert sighed, as if burdened by her misunderstanding. "We kept you safe," he corrected. "You lived here. Utilities are not free. Groceries are not free. Property taxes are not free. You were an adult." The words were factual, measured, almost rehearsed. Emily let them settle. She had never denied that living at home had value. She had never expected to stay without contributing. But she remembered the specific language her father had used, the promise that the money would not disappear into general expenses, that it would accumulate for her benefit. "If it was rent," she asked quietly, "why did you call it savings?" Robert's jaw tightened slightly, the first visible shift in his composure. "I called it discipline," he said. "And you learned it." The answer was clever. It was also evasive. Emily realized that this conversation was not about misunderstanding numbers. It was about definitions, about power, about who controlled the narrative. Standing there in the house she once considered temporary, she understood that her father believed he had every right to redefine the past. And if she allowed it, he would redefine her future as well. Emily did not raise her voice after that. She simply looked at her father for a long moment, as if she were memorizing him, then nodded once and walked toward the door. Linda called her name softly, but it sounded distant, almost ceremonial, like a line delivered out of obligation rather than conviction. Outside, the evening air was cool and steady, and Emily inhaled deeply before getting into her car. On the drive back to her apartment, something shifted inside her that had nothing to do with money. It was the realization that this was not a misunderstanding to be corrected, but a position to be defended. Her father believed he was right. He believed that redefining the arrangement after the fact was acceptable because authority, in his mind, belonged to him. When she reached home, she did not open her spreadsheet this time. Instead, she opened a blank document and began writing down everything she could remember from the original conversation 4 years ago. The phrasing, the tone, the specific promise about helping her buy a house. She wrote down dates, approximate timelines, and every email reference she could locate. The process felt methodical, almost clinical, and for the first time since that dinner, her hands stopped shaking. Around 10 o'clock, her phone rang. It was Robert. She let it go to voicemail. A minute later, a message appeared. "You are making this bigger than it needs to be. We provided for you for nearly 3 decades. Think about that." Emily read the words carefully. "Provided for you." The sentence reframed her adulthood as a debt rather than a transition. She sat back in her chair and allowed the implication to settle. If the past 4 years were payment for childhood, then there would never be an endpoint. There would always be something owed. She replied with a single sentence. "I am not discussing feelings. I am discussing numbers." The typing indicator appeared almost immediately, then disappeared. No answer came. In the quiet of her apartment, Emily began calculating what she had left in her personal savings account. It was not enough for the down payment she had envisioned, but it was enough to cover first and last month's rent somewhere new if she needed to relocate. The idea of starting over without their involvement felt intimidating, but it also felt clean. For years she had believed that patience and obedience would lead to stability. Now she understood that clarity might require distance. She closed her laptop, turned off the kitchen light, and stood in the dim glow of the street lamp outside her window. The future she had imagined was gone. In its place was something less certain, but entirely her own. The next morning, Emily woke up before her alarm and reached for her phone without thinking. There were 2 missed calls from her father and 1 text from her mother that read, "Please do not shut us out. We can talk calmly." The word calmly felt misplaced, as if the previous conversations had been anything but controlled. She set the phone down and stared at the ceiling, listening to the low hum of traffic outside her apartment window. For years, she had measured stability by proximity to her parents, believing that staying close meant staying secure. Now proximity felt like exposure. She got up, dressed carefully, and before leaving for work, logged into her online banking account. Her finger hovered over the scheduled transfer set for the first of the month. $3,000. The routine had been automatic for 4 years. She clicked on the recurring payment and selected cancel. The confirmation screen appeared almost instantly. Transfer successfully stopped. It was a small action, almost invisible in the grand scheme of her finances, but it felt decisive. Around noon, her phone rang again. This time she answered. "Emily," Robert said, his tone firm but controlled. "I noticed the transfer did not go through." She leaned back in her office chair and looked at the city skyline through the window. "That is correct," she replied. There was a pause on the other end, a subtle recalibration. "We had an understanding," he said. "You contributed to this household." The phrasing was deliberate. Contributed. Not saved. Not invested. "I no longer live in that household," she answered evenly. "And I no longer agree with the terms." Silence followed, longer this time. She imagined him standing in the kitchen, one hand resting on the counter, calculating. "You are being emotional," he finally said. "This is not how adults handle family matters." Emily felt something steady settle into place. For the first time, she recognized the strategy. If she was emotional, then he remained rational. If she was impulsive, then he was responsible. "I am handling it financially," she said. Which is exactly how it began. He exhaled sharply, not quite a sigh, not quite frustration. "You would not have been able to save that kind of money on your own," he said. The sentence was meant to diminish, to suggest dependency. Emily glanced at the budget document still open on her laptop, the careful columns she had maintained without fail. "I already did," she replied. "Every month." When the call ended, she did not feel victorious. She felt clear. The cancellation of that transfer marked a boundary she had never drawn before. It did not recover what was gone, but it prevented the pattern from continuing. That afternoon, she emailed her mortgage lender and asked about revised options based solely on her current savings. The numbers were tighter, the choices smaller, but they were real. And for the first time since that dinner, real felt better than promised. By the end of the week, the silence between Emily and her parents had taken on a shape of its own, heavy but contained. They did not call again after that last conversation, and she did not reach out. Instead, she focused on what she could measure. She met with her mortgage lender in person that Friday afternoon, sitting across from a man in his 40s who reviewed her revised numbers with polite efficiency. Without the $144,000 she had believed existed, her options narrowed significantly. The lender explained interest rates, private mortgage insurance, and the minimum down payment required for a modest condominium rather than a detached house. Emily listened carefully, taking notes, asking direct questions. She did not mention her parents. She did not mention the arrangement. She simply adjusted the plan. When she left the office, she felt neither defeated nor triumphant. She felt informed. That evening, she toured a small 2-bedroom townhouse on the edge of the city. It had older carpeting and a kitchen that would need updating, but it was within reach based on her current savings and salary alone. As she walked through the empty living room, she imagined furniture arranged against the walls, bookshelves filled with the novels she had kept in storage, a dining table chosen without consultation. The space was not the house she had once envisioned with a white mailbox and a wide yard, but it was tangible. It existed without anyone else's permission. Later that night, her phone buzzed with a new message from Linda. "Your father is worried about you making impulsive decisions. You are pulling away from us." Emily read the message slowly. She understood the concern beneath the words, but she also recognized the framing. Pulling away suggested abandonment. Independence suggested responsibility. She typed back, "I am making decisions based on the information I have. That is not impulsive. It is necessary." She placed the phone face down on the counter and returned to her laptop, reviewing her budget again. Every line item was hers. Every number was transparent. There was no hidden column, no reinterpretation. For the first time since the dinner that changed everything, she felt a quiet shift in balance. The money she had lost could not be recovered easily, and perhaps not at all, but the pattern that allowed it to happen had been interrupted. In the absence of their approval, she found something steadier. Not anger, not revenge, just a growing understanding that her future would be smaller than she once imagined, but it would also be simpler, and simplicity, she realized, did not require laughter from across a dinner table to validate it. 2 weeks later, Emily stood in the parking lot of the townhouse with a folder tucked under her arm and a decision forming quietly in her mind. The inspection report had come back that morning. The roof was older than she would have preferred, the water heater would likely need replacement within a year, and the kitchen cabinets showed signs of wear. None of it was catastrophic. None of it was perfect. She walked through the front door again, this time alone, and let the quiet settle around her. The living room echoed slightly when she stepped across the carpet, and she tried to imagine it filled with the ordinary sounds of her own life rather than the expectations of anyone else. There would be no ceremonial approval, no father reviewing the purchase agreement, no mother reminding her to negotiate harder. Just her signature, her responsibility, her outcome. That evening, Robert called again. She let it ring twice before answering. "We heard you were looking at properties," he said without greeting. The phrasing told her everything. Heard. Information traveled through relatives and mutual acquaintances faster than through direct conversation. "I am," she replied. "Without consulting us," he added. The statement was not a question. Emily leaned against the kitchen counter, watching the late afternoon light stretch across the tile floor. "I am consulting professionals," she said calmly. "A lender, an inspector, a realtor." There was a pause, then a shift in tone. "You are making this harder than it needs to be," he said. "If you had continued with the plan, we could have worked something out." The plan. The word felt abstract now, almost fictional. "The plan was never written," she answered. "Only assumed." He did not respond immediately. When he did, his voice carried something new, something closer to frustration than confidence. "Family does not operate on paperwork," he said. "Family operates on trust." Emily looked around the empty townhouse in her mind and understood the irony. Trust without clarity had cost her $144,000. "Then trust should survive transparency," she said quietly. "It should not fear it." The conversation ended without resolution, but it did not leave her shaken. Later that night, she sat at her apartment table with the purchase agreement in front of her. The numbers were tighter than she once hoped. The monthly payment would require careful budgeting. There would be no dramatic transformation, no instant security. But as she signed her name at the bottom of the page, she felt something steadier than excitement. She felt ownership, not just of the property, but of the process. The future she was stepping into was smaller than the one she had imagined years ago, but it was built on verified numbers, documented terms, and decisions she understood completely. And for the first time, that was enough. Closing day arrived on a gray Tuesday morning, and Emily signed the final documents with a steady hand that surprised her. The title company office smelled faintly of coffee and printer toner, and the stack of papers in front of her was thick but straightforward. Each page had a purpose. Each number had a definition. She read every line carefully, not because she mistrusted the process, but because she respected it. When the closing agent slid the keys across the table, they made a soft metallic sound against the polished surface. It was not dramatic. There was no applause, just a quiet transfer of responsibility. That afternoon, she drove to the townhouse alone. The sky threatened rain, and the neighborhood looked ordinary in the most reassuring way. Children rode bicycles near the corner. A woman walked her dog along the sidewalk. Nothing about the place suggested grandeur. It suggested maintenance, consistency, effort. She unlocked the front door and stepped inside, the empty rooms greeting her with a hollow echo. The carpeting still needed to be replaced. The kitchen cabinets would have to wait for upgrades. But the space belonged to her in a way nothing else had before. Her phone buzzed while she stood in the center of the living room. A message from Robert appeared on the screen. "We heard you closed on something smaller than what you deserved. You did not have to settle." The words were almost generous, but they carried a familiar undertone. "You deserved better if you had stayed aligned with us." Emily read the message twice before responding. "I chose what I can sustain on my own." She did not add anything else. She did not explain interest rates or down payment percentages or the practical advantages of a manageable mortgage. She did not justify the size of the yard or the age of the roof. She set the phone down on the bare kitchen counter and walked through the rooms again, visualizing paint colors, measuring walls for shelves, estimating the cost of replacing the water heater next year. Each decision would require discipline. Each improvement would be gradual. There would be no sudden windfall, no retroactive correction of the past. But there would also be no reinterpretation. The numbers attached to this house were transparent and signed in ink. As evening settled in, she sat on the living room floor with her back against the wall and listened to the quiet hum of the building's heating system. The silence did not feel like absence. It felt like space. Space to rebuild savings. Space to reconsider boundaries. Space to understand that independence was not a dramatic break, but a series of consistent choices. The $144,000 she once believed would launch her into homeownership was gone, absorbed into a narrative she could not rewrite. But this set of keys, resting in her palm, represented something more durable than a promise. They represented terms she had read, questioned, and accepted with full awareness. And that awareness, she realized, was worth more than any number once spoken across a dinner table. Moving day came quietly, without ceremony, and Emily chose to keep it that way. She rented a small moving truck for 4 hours, measured her furniture twice before loading it, and asked one close friend from work to help her carry the heavier boxes. There were no family members standing in the driveway offering advice about weight distribution or warning her to be careful with the corners of the sofa. There was only the sound of cardboard sliding against cardboard and the steady rhythm of practical effort. By late afternoon, her apartment was empty and the townhouse was filled with uneven stacks of labeled boxes. She returned the truck before sunset, then drove back to her new address with a bag of basic groceries in the passenger seat. Milk, eggs, bread, coffee. The essentials felt symbolic in their simplicity. When she unlocked the front door that evening, the house no longer echoed the same way. The space held her belongings now. The air felt warmer, more settled. She placed the groceries in the refrigerator, plugged in the coffee maker, and set her laptop on the kitchen counter. As she was adjusting the thermostat, her phone rang. It was Linda. Emily hesitated only a moment before answering. "We heard you moved in today," her mother said gently. "Your father thinks you should not rush into things like this without support." The word support lingered in the space between them. Emily leaned against the wall, looking at the bare staircase leading to the second floor. "I am not rushing," she replied. "I am proceeding." Linda was quiet for a few seconds. "He feels hurt," she said finally. "He feels like you do not trust him anymore." Emily considered that. Trust, she realized, was not the same as obedience. "Trust requires clarity," she said softly. "And clarity requires agreement on what happened." There was no accusation in her tone, only observation. Linda did not argue. She did not defend. She simply exhaled, as if the weight of the past few weeks had reached her as well. After the call ended, Emily walked through each room slowly, turning on lamps, adjusting blinds, arranging a few books on a temporary shelf. The house did not feel complete. It felt honest. Every expense from this point forward would be documented. Every payment would be tied to a signed agreement. There would be no reinterpretation later, no laughter to blurred definitions. As night settled over the neighborhood, she sat at her small kitchen table with a cup of coffee and reviewed her updated budget. The mortgage payment was manageable. The utilities were predictable. The margin for error was thinner than she once hoped, but it was real. She understood it fully. And in that understanding, she found something stronger than reassurance. She found stability built not on promises, but on terms she had chosen and signed herself. The first weekend in the townhouse arrived without announcement, and Emily treated it like a work project rather than a milestone. She woke up early on Saturday, brewed coffee in her own kitchen for the first time, and sat at the small table with a legal pad beside her mug. The house required attention in measurable ways. The carpet on the stairs needed replacement. The upstairs bathroom faucet dripped steadily enough to matter over time. The water heater, according to the inspection report, had perhaps 12 months left before it would require upgrading. She wrote each item down in neat columns, assigning estimated costs beside them. $300 for the faucet, $2,000 for carpet, $1,200 for a mid-range water heater installation. The numbers were not overwhelming. They were simply real. Around mid-morning, she received an email notification. It was from Robert. The subject line read, "Financial Perspective." She opened it slowly. The message contained a brief paragraph explaining that over the course of her childhood, he and Linda had spent significantly more than $144,000 raising her. Tuition, medical insurance, extracurricular activities. The list was framed as context rather than accusation, but the implication was clear. "Investment goes both ways," he wrote. Emily read the email twice and noticed what it did not contain. It did not contain a statement that the arrangement had been miscommunicated. It did not contain an offer to review bank records together. It did not contain regret. It contained arithmetic tied to obligation. She closed her laptop without responding immediately. Instead, she walked upstairs and measured the length of the hallway for carpet replacement. She knelt down and pressed her hand against the worn fibers, feeling the texture beneath her palm. The house did not care about her history. It required maintenance regardless of family narratives. Later that afternoon, she drafted a reply. "I appreciate the sacrifices you made as parents," she wrote. "I do not dispute them. But raising a child is a responsibility, not a loan agreement. The transfers over the past 4 years were presented to me as savings for a home. That is the only framework I am addressing." She reread the message for tone, ensuring it remained measured. No anger, no accusation, only clarification. When she pressed send, she felt a subtle shift in posture, as if standing straighter without realizing she had been leaning before. The response did not arrive that evening. Instead, the quiet of the townhouse filled the space where tension once lived. Emily spent the rest of the day installing new light fixtures in the living room, tightening screws carefully, following the instruction manual step by step. Each action was deliberate, each improvement small but permanent. As the sun set outside her front window, she realized that while her parents were recalculating the past, she was building something in the present. And the present, unlike memory, could not be redefined after the fact. Robert's reply did not arrive until late Sunday evening, and when it did, it was shorter than she expected. "If you believe we intentionally misled you, then there is nothing more to discuss," he wrote. The sentence was precise and carefully balanced, shifting the weight back onto her interpretation rather than his actions. Emily read it while sitting at her kitchen table, a stack of unopened mail beside her and a small lamp casting a warm circle of light across the wood surface. She did not respond immediately. Instead, she allowed the statement to settle. The phrasing implied that the entire situation depended on belief rather than language, on perception rather than promises. She opened her laptop and reread the old emails again, paying attention to tone, to context, to the moments she had once interpreted as encouragement. "Good job staying consistent. Proud of your discipline. Keep building your future." None of those sentences explicitly stated that the funds were segregated or untouched, but none of them contradicted that understanding either. Ambiguity had done the work that clarity should have done. She closed the laptop and stood, walking slowly through the townhouse. The upstairs hallway still smelled faintly of new paint from the touch-ups she had completed that afternoon. The rooms were not fully furnished yet, but they were orderly, intentional. She paused at the window in the second bedroom and looked out. At the neighboring rooftops, each one maintained by someone managing their own obligations. There was something steady about that image. People paying mortgages they understood, signing documents they had read. She returned to the kitchen and typed a final reply. "I am not questioning your intentions. I am clarifying the impact. The understanding I operated under was different from yours. That difference cost me financially. I am adjusting accordingly." She reread the message twice, ensuring the tone remained neutral, then pressed send. There was no dramatic conclusion, no apology, no admission, only the quiet acknowledgement that two versions of the same arrangement had existed simultaneously, and only one of them had been documented. She turned off her phone and placed it in a drawer, not as a statement, but as a boundary. For the first time since the initial dinner conversation, she felt the situation settle into something less chaotic and more defined. The loss remained real. The absence of that $144,000 would shape her timeline for years. But so would the lesson attached to it. Trust without terms was fragile. Discipline without verification was vulnerable. As she washed a single coffee cup in her new sink, she understood that independence was not built in dramatic gestures. It was built in quiet decisions repeated consistently. And from this point forward, every decision she made would be one she could trace, measure, and defend without relying on anyone else's reinterpretation. Monday morning arrived with a clarity that felt almost clinical. Emily woke before sunrise, not from anxiety this time, but from habit. The townhouse was quiet in a different way than her apartment had been. The silence felt owned rather than borrowed. She walked downstairs, brewed coffee, and opened her laptop at the kitchen table. The inbox remained unchanged. No response from Robert. No clarification from Linda. The absence of reply did not surprise her. It confirmed something she had already begun to accept. When definitions fail, silence often replaces explanation. She reviewed her financial dashboard carefully, line by line. Mortgage payment scheduled. Utilities estimated. Emergency fund recalculated. She adjusted her monthly savings goal downward to reflect the new reality, then created a second column labeled Reconstruction Fund. It was not dramatic. It was practical. If $144,000 had disappeared into a version of the past she could not recover, she would rebuild methodically, even if it took years. At work, she found herself unusually focused. Numbers no longer represented abstract goals. They represented boundaries. During her lunch break, she stepped outside the office building and sat on a bench facing the parking lot. The air carried the early hint of autumn. She thought about the way her father had framed the situation as a difference in belief. She understood now that belief was not the issue. Structure was. If an arrangement required trust but avoided documentation, it created space for reinterpretation. That space had cost her. She would not allow it again. Late that afternoon, her phone buzzed with a new message from Linda. "We never intended for you to feel taken advantage of." That was all it said. No numbers. No timeline. No plan to reconcile the difference. Emily read it carefully. The sentence acknowledged emotion without addressing action. She typed slowly. Intent and outcome are not the same. I am focusing on outcome. She did not send more. She did not escalate. She returned to her desk and completed the remaining tasks on her schedule. That evening, back at the townhouse, she unpacked another set of boxes. Books lined the shelves in the living room. Dishes found permanent placement in the cabinets. Each object she arranged represented something tangible, something that existed without debate. The house was still imperfect. The upstairs carpet remained worn. The bathroom faucet still dripped occasionally before she tightened it again. But every improvement she made carried clarity. There were receipts. There were invoices. There were terms she could reference. As she prepared for bed, she realized something subtle had shifted inside her. The need for apology had diminished. The need for acknowledgement had quieted. What remained was simpler. She would operate within frameworks she understood. She would ask for written terms when money moved. She would not confuse proximity with security again. The past would remain unresolved in some ways, but the future no longer depended on someone else's interpretation. And that distinction, quiet as it was, changed everything. 3 weeks passed without another direct conversation, and the silence began to feel less like tension and more like distance. Emily settled into a routine that no longer included checking her phone for clarifications that would never come. Each morning she left for work from her own driveway, locking the front door behind her with a deliberate turn of the key. Each evening she returned to the townhouse and continued small improvements. She replaced the upstairs faucet on a Wednesday night after watching 2 instructional videos and laying her tools neatly across the bathroom counter. The repair cost less than she expected and took longer than planned, but when the drip stopped completely, the quiet felt earned. On Friday, a formal letter arrived in her mailbox, addressed in her father's handwriting. She opened it at the kitchen table, recognizing the weight of paper as something intentional. The letter explained, in measured language, that while there had been no written agreement regarding the funds she transferred over 4 years, her parents had always considered those payments a contribution to household expenses. It outlined costs from that period: property taxes, utilities, maintenance. It reiterated that raising her had involved significant financial sacrifice. The tone was not aggressive. It was structured. The message was clear. Their position would not change. Emily read the letter twice and placed it flat on the table. She did not feel shock. She felt confirmation. The past would not be renegotiated. That afternoon, she called her bank and inquired about opening a separate high-yield savings account dedicated to long-term investments. The representative walked her through the process, explaining interest rates and transfer limits. Everything was documented. Every term was transparent. She funded the new account with a modest initial deposit and scheduled automatic contributions based on her adjusted budget. The number would grow slowly. It would not resemble what she once believed she had accumulated, but it would be defined. That evening, she drafted a final response to the letter. "I understand your position," she wrote. "I will not pursue this further. Going forward, I will manage my finances independently and without shared arrangements." She kept the language neutral, almost formal. There was no accusation, no appeal, only closure. She sealed the envelope and placed it in the outgoing mail slot the next morning. As she walked back toward her front door, she noticed how steady her steps felt. There was no dramatic severing of ties. No confrontation in a raised voice. Just a shift in structure. Her parents would remain part of her life in some capacity, but not as custodians of her future. That role now belonged solely to her. Inside the townhouse, sunlight filtered through the blinds, illuminating the room in quiet, even lines. The space was still modest. The improvements were still ongoing. But every square foot carried one consistent truth. Nothing within these walls existed on an undefined promise. And that consistency, she realized, was the foundation she had been searching for all along. The following week unfolded without confrontation, but not without consequence. Emily noticed the shift first in the smallest ways. Her mother stopped sending casual messages about grocery sales or neighborhood updates. Her father no longer forwarded articles about financial discipline or long-term planning. The absence of those routine communications created a new pattern, one that felt deliberate rather than accidental. On Sunday afternoon, Linda called unexpectedly. Her voice sounded softer than usual, measured but careful. She asked about the townhouse, about whether the water heater had been replaced yet, about whether the neighbors seemed friendly. The questions were practical, almost polite. Emily answered each one calmly. Yes, the neighbors were quiet. No, the water heater was still functioning. Yes, the mortgage payment was scheduled automatically. The conversation hovered on the surface, never dipping into unresolved territory. After a pause, Linda said, "Your father believes you are building walls." The phrase lingered. Emily looked around her living room, where newly installed shelves held her books in neat rows. "I am building structure," she replied. There was no tension in her voice, just precision. Linda exhaled quietly. "He does not understand why you will not let this go." Emily considered the wording carefully. Letting it go would imply returning to the original framework, accepting the reinterpretation without adjustment. Instead, she had chosen redefinition. "I have let it go," she said evenly. "I'm not asking for the money anymore. I am asking for clarity moving forward." The distinction mattered. After the call ended, she sat for a moment in the stillness of the room. She realized that the conflict was no longer about $144,000. It was about authority, about whether adulthood required ongoing approval. That evening, she reviewed her new investment account and transferred another modest contribution into it. The number was small compared to what she once believed she had accumulated, but it was hers. Documented. Verified. No one else had access to it. Later that night, she received a short message from Robert. "We did what we thought was right. You will understand one day." Emily. Read the sentence carefully. It was not an apology. It was not a correction. It was a closing argument. She did not respond immediately. Instead, she walked through her townhouse, checking the locks on the doors, adjusting the thermostat by 2 degrees, making small, intentional choices about her environment. When she finally replied, her message was brief. "I understand enough." That was all. She placed the phone face down on the counter and turned off the lights one by one. The house settled into darkness gradually, room by room, each space quiet and contained. She realized that understanding did not require agreement. It required recognition, and recognition, once achieved, could not be undone.